The moment you walk away, the narcissist does not lose just a relationship. They lose a mirror that reflected the version of themselves they desperately needed to believe was real. And that loss begins a psychological chain reaction they never expected. What happens next is far more complicated than anger or revenge. There are 5 distinct stages of regret that unfold beneath the surface. Most people never recognize them because they are hidden behind pride, silence, manipulation, and carefully maintained appearances. Many assume narcissists never regret losing someone. Others believe they immediately move on without looking back. Both ideas miss something important. Regret does not always appear as tears, apologies, or obvious sadness. Sometimes it disguises itself as arrogance. Sometimes it appears as sudden confidence, new relationships, public happiness, or complete silence. The human mind often protects itself by hiding uncomfortable emotions behind defenses that look like the exact opposite of vulnerability. That is why today's discussion may completely change how you understand what really happens after you decide to leave. The first stage begins almost immediately after you walk away, but it rarely looks like regret from the outside. Instead, it appears as confidence, indifference, or even relief. This is because the narcissistic mind is organized around protecting a carefully constructed self-image. When the relationship ends, the first threat is not loneliness, but the sudden absence of someone who consistently reinforced that image. For a time, the mind responds by insisting that nothing important has been lost. It tells itself that there will always be someone else, another admirer, another source of validation, another opportunity to prove superiority. This internal narrative acts as a psychological shield, delaying the emotional impact of separation. Beneath that shield, however, a different process quietly begins. Human beings naturally become accustomed to predictable emotional patterns. Even relationships filled with conflict create routines that the brain learns to expect. Daily attention, admiration, arguments, reassurance, and emotional reactions all become familiar signals. When those signals disappear, the nervous system notices the absence long before conscious awareness does. The narcissist may continue with work, social activities, or new relationships, believing they have moved on, yet subtle feelings of restlessness and dissatisfaction begin to emerge. They cannot easily identify the source because their attention remains focused on preserving the illusion of complete control. This emotional void is particularly unsettling because it cannot be filled immediately. The external admiration they once relied upon may still exist, but it lacks the familiarity and certainty of the person who knew them intimately. New attention feels exciting for a moment, but it does not recreate the psychological comfort that developed through repetition. The mind starts comparing present experiences with what has been lost, often without fully acknowledging that such comparisons are taking place. To reduce this discomfort, they frequently convince themselves that walking away benefited them. They may speak negatively about their former partner, exaggerate flaws, or portray themselves as the one who escaped a difficult situation. These stories are less about deceiving others than about calming their own internal conflict. Every repeated justification temporarily strengthens the belief that they remain untouched by the separation. Yet the more energy invested in defending that belief, the more it reveals an underlying instability. Over time, small reminders begin breaking through these defenses. Familiar places, shared routines, quiet evenings, or unexpected memories trigger emotions that no amount of rationalization can fully suppress. What initially felt like freedom slowly becomes an unfamiliar emptiness. The absence of consistent emotional supply is no longer theoretical but experiential, forcing the first cracks to appear in the protective image they worked so hard to maintain. The second stage begins when the emotional emptiness can no longer be dismissed as a temporary inconvenience. At first, the narcissist may have believed that replacing one relationship with another would restore their sense of certainty. They often pursue new sources of admiration with confidence, expecting the same emotional reinforcement they once received. Yet something unexpected happens. The attention may still arrive, compliments may still be offered, and new people may still be impressed, but the internal satisfaction fades much faster than anticipated. The excitement of novelty cannot compensate for the loss of a familiar source of validation that had become woven into their daily psychological routine. This is the point where the collapse of external validation quietly unfolds. Their emotional stability has always depended heavily on feedback from the outside world, rather than on a deeply rooted sense of self-worth. As long as admiration, attention, or influence flowed consistently, they could maintain the belief that they were exceptional, indispensable, or beyond criticism. Once that dependable stream disappears, maintaining the same level of confidence becomes increasingly difficult. They begin seeking reassurance more frequently, becoming unusually sensitive to small signs of rejection, delayed responses, or perceived disrespect. The mind responds by working harder to protect its self-image. They may post more on social media, become unusually focused on appearance, achievements, or public recognition, or surround themselves with people who reinforce their preferred identity. These behaviors are often attempts to recreate the emotional certainty that once came naturally within the previous relationship. Each compliment provides temporary relief, but the effect fades quickly, requiring another dose of approval to keep uncomfortable feelings at bay. As this pattern repeats, frustration quietly grows. The problem is not that admiration has disappeared completely, but that it no longer produces the same emotional impact. Validation that once felt satisfying now feels incomplete, almost as though something essential is missing. Because acknowledging this loss would require admitting vulnerability, the mind searches for external explanations instead. They may blame other people for being ungrateful, shallow, or incapable of appreciating them, rather than recognizing that the real struggle comes from an internal dependence on constant affirmation. Memories of the former partner begin surfacing in unexpected ways. Certain conversations, routines, or moments of unwavering attention return to mind, not necessarily because of love, but because they represented a reliable source of emotional reinforcement. The realization remains largely unconscious, yet it shapes behavior more than they recognize. Their confidence becomes increasingly performative, requiring greater effort to sustain, while moments of genuine self-assurance become shorter and less convincing. The emotional foundation that once seemed unshakable now depends on constant external input, revealing how fragile it had always been beneath the carefully maintained image. The third stage emerges when denial begins losing its effectiveness, but acceptance still feels too threatening. At this point, the narcissist is caught between two conflicting realities. One part of the mind continues insisting that leaving the relationship made no difference, while another part quietly recognizes that something valuable has disappeared. This internal conflict creates psychological tension that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Rather than facing it directly, the mind often responds by constructing elaborate explanations designed to preserve the image of superiority while avoiding emotional accountability. During this stage, they frequently rewrite the history of the relationship. Moments of genuine connection may be minimized, while disagreements and imperfections become exaggerated. They convince themselves that the relationship was always destined to fail, that their former partner was never truly worthy of them, or that they simply became bored and moved on. These narratives are not always deliberate lies. They function as protective stories that allow the individual to avoid confronting feelings of disappointment, vulnerability, or personal loss. The more uncertain they feel internally, the more confidently they may repeat these revised versions of the past. At the same time, unexpected contradictions begin appearing in their behavior. They may claim complete indifference while secretly checking social media, asking mutual acquaintances for updates, or paying close attention to any information about the person who left. Outwardly, they continue projecting confidence, yet inwardly they remain emotionally invested in proving that they have not been affected. This contradiction reveals how denial operates as a defense rather than a reflection of genuine emotional freedom. The absence of their former partner also begins challenging the illusion of complete control. Throughout the relationship, they may have assumed they could return whenever they wished, influence emotions whenever necessary, or maintain a position of psychological dominance. Discovering that someone has truly walked away disrupts that expectation. The realization that another person can choose distance without seeking approval introduces a level of uncertainty they are not accustomed to managing, because acknowledging this uncertainty would threaten their carefully protected self-image. Emotional energy is redirected into comparison, distraction, or self-promotion. They may become unusually competitive, emphasize personal achievements, or seek situations where they can once again feel admired and influential. These efforts provide temporary reassurance, but they cannot fully silence the growing awareness that external success does not erase unresolved emotional experiences. As denial continues weakening, memories become more emotionally charged. Instead of recalling only conflicts, the mind begins revisiting moments that once reinforced feelings of importance, certainty, and admiration. What they originally dismissed as insignificant now carries unexpected emotional weight. The protective narrative that once felt convincing begins developing small inconsistencies, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the belief that losing the relationship had no meaningful psychological impact. The fourth stage begins when comparison quietly replaces denial. By this point, the narcissist has often invested considerable energy in proving that life has improved since the relationship ended. They may have pursued new romantic interests, expanded their social circle, or immersed themselves in achievements that reinforce an image of success. On the surface, these experiences appear to confirm that they have moved on. Yet beneath the appearance of progress, the mind begins measuring every new interaction against the emotional familiarity of the relationship that was lost. This comparison is rarely conscious at first. Instead, it appears as a vague sense that something is missing. New people may offer admiration, attention, or excitement, but they do not respond in exactly the same way. They have different personalities, different boundaries, and different expectations. The emotional patterns the narcissist once relied upon are no longer predictable. They discover that rebuilding the same level of influence over another person requires time, effort, and uncertainty. What they assumed would be easily replaceable now reveals itself to have been far more psychologically significant than expected. As these comparisons continue, idealization slowly begins to emerge. The mind starts remembering selected moments from the previous relationship with greater emotional intensity than before. Conversations once taken for granted become meaningful. Acts of loyalty that were previously overlooked begin standing out. Even ordinary routines gain emotional importance because they represented consistency and familiarity. This does not mean they suddenly remember the relationship accurately. Instead, the mind selectively highlights experiences that satisfy an emotional need while minimizing the conflicts that once dominated their attention. This selective remembering creates a powerful contradiction. The same person they once criticized or devalued now appears unusually unique. Qualities that seemed ordinary during the relationship become difficult to find elsewhere. Their patience, understanding, emotional investment, or willingness to remain committed may now be viewed through an entirely different lens. The narcissist may never openly admit these realizations, but they influence thoughts, emotions, and behavior in subtle yet persistent ways. At the same time, frustration with new relationships often increases. New partners may establish healthier boundaries, question inconsistent behavior, or refuse to provide constant reassurance. Instead of offering endless validation, they expect mutual respect and emotional reciprocity. This difference can make the narcissist feel unexpectedly dissatisfied, even if the new relationship appears successful from the outside. The issue is not necessarily the new person, but the growing awareness that what was once available without appreciation cannot simply be recreated on demand. As comparison deepens, regret begins shifting from an abstract feeling into a more personal realization. The absence is no longer defined only by lost admiration or diminished control. It becomes connected to a specific individual whose emotional presence can no longer be substituted as easily as they once believed, making the consequences of their past behavior increasingly difficult to dismiss. If you've reached this point, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments which stage surprised you the most. Understanding these psychological patterns helps you recognize manipulation, protect your emotional well-being, and avoid confusing temporary regret with genuine personal growth. The fifth stage is where regret becomes impossible to keep buried beneath pride, distraction, or carefully constructed stories. By now, the emotional strategies that once protected the narcissist have begun losing their effectiveness. New relationships no longer provide the same excitement, achievements fail to erase the lingering sense of absence, and constant reassurance from others produces only temporary relief. What remains is a growing awareness that the person who walked away represented something far more significant than they were willing to admit. This realization often arrives gradually through repeated moments of disappointment rather than a single dramatic event. At this stage, the narcissist may begin replaying past conversations with unusual intensity. Words that were once ignored suddenly take on new meaning. Warnings that seemed insignificant now appear surprisingly accurate. They may recognize patterns in their own behavior that contributed to the relationship's collapse. But this awareness is often incomplete. Rather than fully accepting responsibility, they alternate between brief moments of insight and familiar defensive thinking. One day they acknowledge that they made serious mistakes, and the next they convince themselves the other person was equally responsible. This emotional inconsistency reflects an internal struggle between preserving the ego and confronting uncomfortable truths. The feeling of regret also becomes more personal because it is no longer focused solely on losing attention or admiration. Instead, they begin recognizing the uniqueness of the individual they lost. They remember emotional support that was consistently available, patience that endured repeated disappointments, or loyalty that remained despite difficult circumstances. These qualities become more valuable in hindsight because they are not easily replaced. The realization that someone genuinely invested in them chose to leave challenges the belief that people will always remain available regardless of how they are treated. This growing awareness can trigger attempts to reconnect. They may send unexpected messages, revisit shared places, ask mutual acquaintances about the former partner, or create situations that increase the chances of crossing paths again. Sometimes these efforts are subtle, while other times they are dramatic and emotionally charged. However, the motivation behind these actions is often complex. Genuine regret may exist alongside a desire to restore control, repair damaged self-esteem, or prove that they still have influence over the person who left. Whether they reach meaningful self-reflection depends on their willingness to tolerate emotional discomfort without immediately defending against it. For many, admitting the full extent of their responsibility threatens the identity they have spent years protecting. As a result, regret may remain trapped between recognition and resistance, surfacing in quiet moments when distractions fade and the reality of what was lost becomes impossible to deny, even if they never openly confess it to anyone else. After regret has become emotionally difficult to ignore, many narcissists enter a phase that appears to be about reconciliation, but is often driven by a deeper need to regain psychological stability. The loss has disrupted their sense of influence, and the uncertainty of not knowing whether they still matter to the person who left can become increasingly uncomfortable. Rather than sitting with that discomfort, they may attempt to reestablish contact in ways that seem spontaneous or heartfelt. These efforts can create the impression of personal growth, but the underlying motivation deserves careful attention. Their approach is rarely identical from one situation to another. Some become unexpectedly warm and affectionate, expressing appreciation they never showed during the relationship. Others send brief messages that appear casual, but are carefully timed to reopen communication. They might mention shared memories, apologize in broad terms, or ask seemingly innocent questions that create an opportunity for continued conversation. In other cases, they rely on mutual friends, social media activity, or indirect signals designed to remind the former partner of their presence without making a direct request for reconciliation. What makes this stage psychologically complex is that regret and the desire for control can exist at the same time. A person may genuinely miss someone while also wanting to restore the emotional dynamic that once benefited them. Missing a relationship does not automatically mean they have developed greater empathy, accepted responsibility, or changed the patterns that caused the relationship to fail. Emotional pain can motivate contact without producing meaningful self-awareness. If the former partner responds quickly, the narcissist often experiences temporary relief. The simple knowledge that communication is still possible can reduce feelings of rejection and restore a sense of confidence. Because of this, the intensity of their efforts may decrease once reassurance has been obtained. This pattern can be confusing for the other person, who may interpret the initial persistence as evidence of lasting transformation, only to discover that old behaviors gradually reappear. When attempts to reconnect are unsuccessful, frustration frequently increases. They may alternate between kindness and criticism, admiration and dismissal, hope and resentment. These emotional swings reflect difficulty tolerating the reality that another person has maintained firm boundaries. Instead of accepting that the relationship has ended, the mind searches for ways to regain emotional influence or preserve self-esteem. Real personal change requires more than feeling loss or expressing regret. It involves developing the capacity to recognize another person's perspective, accepting responsibility without shifting blame, and making consistent behavioral changes over time. Without that deeper internal work, repeated attempts to reconnect often become another strategy for reducing personal discomfort rather than building the foundation for a healthier relationship. The final stage is not defined by what the narcissist feels, but by what the person who walked away begins to understand. By this point, the focus gradually shifts away from analyzing the narcissist's emotions and toward recognizing the deeper psychological lesson hidden within the entire experience. One of the most important realizations is that regret and accountability are not the same thing. A narcissist may sincerely regret losing the relationship, miss the emotional security it provided, or wish they had acted differently in certain moments. However, those feelings alone do not guarantee a meaningful change in character or behavior. Many people become confused because expressions of regret can sound remarkably convincing. The narcissist may admit mistakes, speak about loneliness, or describe how much they have suffered since the separation. These admissions can create hope that genuine transformation has taken place. Yet lasting change is measured less by emotional words and more by consistent actions. Someone who has truly developed greater emotional awareness demonstrates it through patience, respect for boundaries, acceptance of responsibility, and a willingness to tolerate discomfort without returning to manipulation or blame. This distinction becomes especially important because emotional pain often motivates temporary changes. The fear of permanent loss can encourage self-reflection, apologies, or promises that were never offered before. While these responses may be sincere in the moment, sincerity alone does not resolve deeply established behavioral patterns. Lasting growth requires repeated choices over time, especially when circumstances are no longer emotionally urgent. The real test begins after the immediate crisis has passed, when there is no longer a strong external incentive to behave differently. For the person who walked away, this stage often brings a renewed sense of emotional clarity. Instead of measuring the relationship by isolated moments of affection or regret, they begin evaluating it by long-term patterns. They recognize that respect cannot depend on the threat of abandonment, and that empathy has greater value when it is present throughout the relationship rather than appearing only after irreversible consequences have arrived. This shift in perspective strengthens emotional independence because it reduces the temptation to confuse remorse with genuine accountability. Over time, the experience itself becomes a source of wisdom rather than ongoing confusion. The emotional energy once spent trying to understand another person's reactions is gradually redirected toward understanding personal boundaries, self-respect, and healthier relationship dynamics. The narcissist's regret, whether profound or superficial, no longer determines the future. What becomes most significant is the ability to recognize the difference between temporary emotional responses and enduring psychological change, allowing decisions to be guided by observable behavior instead of hopeful interpretations. As we reach the end of this journey, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest victory after walking away is not watching a narcissist experience regret. It is reclaiming the parts of yourself that were slowly disappearing while trying to keep the relationship alive. Their regret, if it comes, follows its own unpredictable path. It may emerge through denial, comparison, loneliness, or repeated attempts to reconnect. But regret alone is not the same as growth, and longing is not the same as love. Real transformation is measured by consistent accountability, genuine empathy, and lasting behavioral change. Your responsibility is not to wait for someone else's awakening. It is to protect your own emotional well-being, trust what your experiences have taught you, and recognize that healthy relationships never require you to abandon your self-respect in exchange for temporary peace. Every step you take toward emotional clarity weakens the power of manipulation and strengthens your ability to choose relationships built on honesty, mutual respect, and emotional maturity. If this message helped you see these psychological patterns more clearly, take a moment to reflect on how far you've come rather than how much someone else has lost. Sometimes the most powerful ending is not when another person regrets your absence. It is when you no longer need their regret to validate your decision. That is the moment you stop surviving the past and begin creating a future defined by confidence, inner peace, and emotional freedom. If you found this speech valuable, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. And tell us in the comments, which stage do you believe is the hardest for a narcissist to face? And which lesson changed your perspective the most? Your insight could be exactly what someone else needs to hear.